saying, in essence, that there's no such thing as a race.
Oh, I maintain that race is the phoniest issue ever invented by the mind of man. The European invented and developed the concept of race. There's really no such thing as a race, because nature created no races. The whole race is a man-made thing. You know.
Well, how did people get to be French and English?
Well, different climatic conditions and migrations and amalgams of different people, and migrations of people into your country, migrations of people out. All right. Now this is an ethnic grouping as against what we call race. If you go back and you look at an old dictionary, you won't even find a definition for a race. Race grew out of the pseudo-scientific development of Europe, and this is what Rogers was addressing himself to, and saying that according to your rule, which is ridiculous, a lot of you belong to us.
Well, in another context, if race is arbitrary, then could we say that being called black was a political term?
It's a political term, and a term which indicates our self-awareness at this juncture in history, and I think we really need it. We need to really bathe in blackness for a while, but I wish we'd get the bath over with and go on to something a little more important, because black in itself is not an ethnic term. Black tells you how you look, but it don't tell you who you are. We are essentially an African people. Wherever we live on this earth, we're essentially an African people. And we relate to the millions of African people throughout the world, including the uncounted millions of Africans in Asia. The word Afro-American or African-American would probably be more appropriate and more honest and more in keeping with what we actually are. Because all of us are not positively, physically, real jet black. And so the argument now sometimes is between the supernationalists and the mild nationalists and blacker than thou, when blackness is a state of mind, a state of attitude, a state of approach to things that can exist in almost any of us, including from the blonde black person to the jet black. And the jet black can be traitors, and they can be patriarchs, they can be a whole lot of... See, we've been everything in history from saint to buffoons. We're a complete people, and we need to start looking at ourselves as a complete people. And I think that once we convinced ourselves that we're black and beautiful, we'll stop saying it and just go ahead and be black and beautiful and release a whole lot of energy for more important things.
All right, since you said that J.A. Rogers was a chronicler that related events, what is there in these two volumes in terms of facts that would be beneficial to black Americans in the regaining of our lost heritage?
In terms of facts, is that J.A. Rogers goes through history and places in proper perspectives with documents the role of the black personality in history, beginning from the origin of man in Africa to the present time. And I'm saying that black people need a measurement of the role that they have played in history. And Rogers was the pioneer in the search for the black personality in history and his role. And this is important because through Rogers, in his first volume on the Old World, you can see what the Africans achieved, and what the Africans not only achieved within Africa, but the conflicts among African and how these conflicts were settled. Egypt was invaded from within Africa, which began the decline. That was the Kushite invasion, led by that magnificent trio of black generals, Castor, Pianki, and Taharqa. And the interesting thing about these men, especially Taharqa, the last of the trio, is that he not only controlled what is Kush, was part of Ethiopia and the Sudan of today, and Egypt, but he invaded Libya and practically all of the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and Iran, all in those areas. And in those areas, he found both friends and foes. Now, if he found friends and enemies, if he found people in the Middle East willing to fight with him, he a black general. This tells you that color wasn't such a major factor, but the power, the rise and fall of power. Rogers tells us some other interesting things in Volume 1. Actually, I wish we had time just to deal with Volume 1 alone, because it tells you of the early European invaders of Africa, after he finished telling you about Akhenaten and the great queens of Egypt, and that woman, the first truly great woman in history, Hatshepsut. About the black generals who served in white armies. Cletus Nigra, who was one of the commanding generals in the army of Alexander. And he deals with the romance around Alexander, which shocked the hell out of some people, because Alexander not only did not die worrying about no worlds to conquer, he died in a drunken stupor, and all this is documented. He threw a dagger at Cletus Nigra, the black general, who differed with him in front of his high command, and he died in self-reproach after this act, not worrying about no more worlds to conquer. It's another thing. And another aspect of Alexander, which I call the so-called great, that we need to take into consideration is Alexander was a magnificent diplomat, probably one of the most brilliant diplomats ever. He really wasn't much of a warrior. In fact, one of the main reasons why Cletus Nigra could kid him, because he had saved his life on the battlefield a number of times. And Alexander, after he got into Asia Minor, was ridiculing Greek soldiers. And Cletus Nigra, the black general, told him, you wasn't, as for Greek soldiers, you really, in effect, not so hot yourself. And he reminded him of the time that he saved his life. And Alexander was a little bit embarrassed and insulted by having this mentioned in front of his high command. And he was drinking too much at the time anyway. Now, that takes a whole lot of romance out of history to treat Alexander that way, but it's documented truth.